Oregon football lost a player in the 2024 recruiting cycle, and their recruiting ranking dropped as a result. No need to worry right now. Here we go.
You are Locked On Ducks, your daily podcast on the Oregon Ducks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, it is that time once again for Locked On Ducks. I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin. Thank you so much for making this your first listen or your first view of the day. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, and your number one source to stay up to date with the Ducks. If you have not already, please like, comment, subscribe, rate, review wherever you listen to or watch this show, which today is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, yikes, official sportsbook of Locked On. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. Recruiting talk, game day games, and history made, all coming up on today's show. We start with the recruiting front, where Oregon picked up another blue chip recruit, meaning a 4 or 5-star player in the 2024 cycle, but they lost one as well, that being Tysier Denmark, who was one of the earliest commits in the 2024 class, wide receiver, ends up flipping over to Penn State. Now, it's easy to do two things, and we should not do either when this sort of stuff happens. Number one, it is really easy, I mean like super duper basic gut level human instinct to say, we didn't need that kid anyway. We don't know that. He might go on to be a really, really good college football player. And you might say, boy, a couple years from now, boy, would have liked to have had him. That would have been really, really good. Because you never know what your roster is going to end up looking like. So that's the first thing it's easy to do that I don't particularly buy into. I saw that from a lot of Oregon fans when Dante Moore decommitted. Well, we got Novosad. He's just as good as whatnot. I like Austin Novosad. Dante Moore is better. There is a much higher chance of Dante Moore having a better career than Novosad compared to Dante Moore. Doesn't mean Novosad can't be good. I really like what I saw from him in the spring game. Needs to bulk up a little bit and such, but I think his potential is very real. However, does not mean you shouldn't just have an actual reaction to someone decommitting from your school, which is, darn, that's a talented kid. I wanted to have him on our team one day. Does this, however, mean the sky is falling for the Ducks? No, I don't anticipate that whatsoever. He'd been committed for, I think he was one of the first 3 or 4 recruits in the 2024 recruiting cycle, so he'd been committed to the Ducks for a while. This sort of stuff happens, right? If you see fans on the other side of the spectrum, by the way, saying, oh, well, congratulations on getting a commit in June. This kid is never going to stay committed. He's just going to end up flipping blah-diddy-blah-diddy-blah. That's not accurate either. The general, again, depends on the school, depends on what happens. If you have a coach leave, for instance, like we had in 2021, yeah, that tends to lead to a lot of decommitments from your university. So, from your program, rather. That sort of stuff is not super common, where you have these massive waves of decommitments and such. And there is no expectation, I do not anticipate, nor does anybody else, that Denmark decommitting is a sign of, trouble, problems, issues. No, it's one of those things that happens, right? If you're getting a bunch of verbal commitments, because that's what these are, right? These are verbal commitments until, pen is on paper and all the paperwork gets signed and dotted to the university, Peyton Bowen. When that happens, that's when a kid is actually going to for sure come and play. But still, when you get a verbal commitment at some point, over 90% of the kids are going to stay committed. And this just happens to be one of the flips, right? It happens. There are other schools that have money. There are other schools that have great programs with great coaches and great recruiters. Oregon has a lot of that. Doesn't mean we're the only one in the country. And I think that's, kind of what this is a reminder of. So that's the first, or I guess those are kind of the first 2 points that I wanted to make on that front. But secondly, this does kind of speak to something that I talked about last week on the show. I did an episode. You can go back and listen to or watch it if you're listening to or watching the show right now and you missed it by chance. But I talked about with Brian Smith, our recruiting insider here at the Locked On Network, about how Oregon has right now a top 5 recruiting class in the country from the high school ranks, right? And there's no portal for 2024. Yeah, that comes, much, much later. But staying in the top 5 was going to be very hard. It's still not impossible, but this is part of the reason that, when we got to that point and, it was obviously exciting, it's great to be in that sort of position. My takeaway was, okay, it's still fairly early. You might have a decommit or a flip, but also big names are still going to come off the board. Oregon can get back into that top 5 range. That is 100% possible in the 2024 recruiting cycle. Denmark decommitting doesn't, make that impossible, so to speak, because we still don't have a 5-star. And we're sitting in the top 10, right? So it's down to number 8 on the 24/7 high school composite rankings nationally. Still a great place to be. Still inside the top 10. And the recruiting momentum is not slowing down because of this. This is just a kid who made a decision at one point in time that Oregon was the right school for him. New information came out, whatever it was, and he decided to go in a different direction. The other reason I'm not panicked or worried about this sort of stuff is, it's common. He's also going to Penn State, which is a really, really high level program. They're the reigning Rose Bowl champions. It's not as if Oregon doesn't have wide receiver depth. I'm not worried positionally about, oh man, I really thought he was going to play as a true freshman. He could have. He might play as a true freshman at Penn State. He might not see the field until he's a junior. He might end up transferring one day. You do not know. And that's something else that I wanted to touch on. Position-wise, Oregon is totally fine at receiver going forward, and there's portal, and there's high school, and all this sort of stuff. But the other thing, too, is he was once verbally committed to the Ducks. He ends up going to Penn State. This is the era of the transfer portal. Who's to say he doesn't end up one day? You don't want to burn this sort of bridge. So don't be the fans, like the Oklahoma fans on the message board when Zadavian Sims chose the Ducks over the Sooners. Don't go out there and rip the kid. Don't say he's terrible, he's no good, he's awful, he's bad. Don't do any of that sort of stuff because it doesn't do anybody any favors. And he might enter the portal one day and we decide, hey, this is someone we're still interested in. He didn't fit the way he wanted to at Penn State, and we may one day want him back. But nothing to worry about here. Totally normal, and Oregon's recruiting class can still be among the best, maybe even the best in program history, even without Tysier Denmark in there. And proof positive that the recruiting momentum is not slowing down is that Oregon added another blue chip prospect in there. In 4-star safety, Kingston Lopa, 6'5", 190 pounds from Sacramento, California. Washington was going after him, and the Ducks end up getting his verbal commitment. So he's helping kind of bolster that a little bit. Denmark was a higher overall rated player, but they're at number 5. They're now down to number 8. And we'll talk more about Lopa and what he brings to the table with Brian Smith later this week because he knows these kids, better than I do. That's why we like bringing him on the show here. But when I was, kind of going through his athletic profile and everything and, looking at his position and whatnot, and Oregon's now got 2 safeties in the 2024 class along with Aaron Flowers. Pretty sure it's just 2. I'll double check that real quick. But they've now got 2 4-star safeties in Aaron Flowers. And then when you add Lopa into the mix, they've got a couple of blue chip guys at that position. They've also got Cody DeCambra, and they've got Tyler Turner in the safety room as well, both 4-star guys from the 2023 class. So I think that position group is looking fairly deep, which Oregon needs to have. Because they're going to lose several safeties at the end of this year. Tysheem Johnson could come back, not sure. Maybe he goes to the NFL, maybe he doesn't. But, you took Jamal Hill out of the room, made him a linebacker. But Steve Stevens, Brian Addison, Evan Williams, all done after this year. So this is a position that you would like to stack up on. You'd like to load up on. And I think that's what Oregon is doing here with DeCambra and Turner already in the room. Johnson could maybe come back for another year. And now in 2024, you'll add Aaron Flowers and now Kingston Lopa to the mix as well. But I think there was one thing in particular about him that was curious. It's not that he hasn't gone to check out FanDuel yet, because I don't think you recommend that for kids of that particular age. However, I recommend it for all of you if you're trying to get your gambling fix out there. Baseball season is in full swing, and there's no better place to get in on the action than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's up to $1,000 back in bonus bets if your first bet doesn't win. Just go to FanDuel.com/lockedon to join today. You can bet Oregon's win total, Pac-12 championship futures. You can even bet lines on certain games. Texas Tech, USC, Washington, all out there. You can go bet them if you feel good about Oregon's chances right now. I don't necessarily recommend that because a lot can change between now and then. But don't miss your chance to snag a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 when you join FanDuel today. Just go to FanDuel.com/lockedon to sign up. FanDuel, official partner of Major League Baseball. Spilled a little water on myself, enjoying the second segment sip. But we have had it, which means we're ready to rock and roll and continue with the show. So, Kingston Lopa, 6'5", 190 pounds from Sacramento. I saw 6'5", 190. I immediately jumped to Brian Addison. And I don't know if this is necessarily a coincidence that you have guys of this size, but Brian Addison, when he came to Oregon, he was an athlete, right? Could kind of play both ways, and he has played both ways. Started out as a receiver, then moved over to safety. He played a lot last year, did well. I have high hopes for what he can do this season for the Ducks and what will be his last year in an Oregon uniform. But I wonder if this is kind of a body type they're looking for, if they like the length that you can have on the outside. And look, it can be hard to find guys who are, super fleet of foot when they're that long, but Addison is kind of the exception to that rule. And I'm curious to see later in the week what Brian has to say about Lopa, because I think that guys who have that sort of length, you can get your hands on balls that are up in the air. You're not going to have a receiver necessarily moss you as easily. I assume we all know the term getting mossed, where a guy just kind of, it's like a posterized version of football where a guy just catches it right over the top of you. But I don't know if he slides in and plays right away. I don't know if he's someone who's more of a developmental piece. We'll talk to Brian later this week and find out. But that's what kind of stood out to me. 6'5", 190, I was like, Brian Addison. And I like what Addison brings at the safety position. He's got great speed. He's got great length, good instincts. He was solid in coverage, according to PFF a season ago. So I think, fundamentally, though, the reason this is a good thing for Oregon is you've got a position group that after this year is looking super thin. I know there's the portal. It's always there. But you want to have options. And I think Lopa, along with Turner and DeCamara and Flowers, I think that's giving Oregon options at that position group in the defensive backfield going forward. But as always, curious as to your guys' thoughts. Drop them in the YouTube comments below or hit me up on Twitter at Smalls_55 or at Locked On Ducks. DMs and mentions wide open, which is how you get in the mailbag too, like LFPB Fishing did. He says, a longtime listener, first-time question asker. My man. Is it possible for Oregon at Washington and USC at Oregon to both be College GameDay locations? Assuming in both games each respective team is undefeated, is it possible? After looking through the slate of games, I believe it is very possible. As a courtesy, I will list all the other possible best games of those weeks. Look at this guy making my job even easier. Gosh, I appreciate you all so very, very much. Week 7, that's the Washington game. The other big games to contend with are USC at Notre Dame, Florida at South Carolina, Texas A&M at Tennessee, Ohio State at Purdue, no way, BYU at TCU, no way. And then Week 11, which is the USC game, Michigan at Penn State, Ohio State at Michigan State, Georgia at Ole Miss, Texas at TCU, ooh, that could be good, Florida at LSU, Miami at FSU, thank you for the show, go Ducks. So, couple things here. College game day games are chosen in the way that I wish college football scheduling was done, on a week-by-week basis. Now, obviously, I'm translating that over from a year-to-year basis rather than doing it so far in advance, but it is done on a week-to-week basis. So predicting this stuff is impossible. But your first question, can they both be game day games? Absolutely. And the reason I think that's super possible is twofold. Number one, threefold, I guess. The record of the teams going into it and the ranking of those teams. Number two, the brands of the teams involved in those potential games. And number three, the locations. So game day, throughout the course of a season, they want to go to a different place every week. They don't want to go to the same place twice. It's happened before where, a game is just too big and, they go to the same campus twice in a season. But typically, they want to go to a new location every week. And there are a lot of factors that go into choosing those particular games. And, it's the big game of the week that everyone's talking about. It's the one that, the fans get excited for. And game day came to Oregon a year ago for Oregon and UCLA. And the Ducks, of course, had an awesome game. And that was one of the reasons that the Bo Nix Heisman hype ticked up and that our college football playoff hopes ticked up in the eyes of media and fans across the country. So I think this stuff absolutely matters, right? It's having games on your schedule where you look at it and say, boy, that could be game day. And it would be awesome, right? It's fun. It's unique to college football. And it also helps your program to get that sort of visibility and be playing in the sort of game that allows people to give credence to the idea that, hey, this is one of the 4 best teams in the country and whatnot. I think all that stuff is great. And game days at Oregon, I mean, come on. Who does it better than us? Really? I mean, like, seriously. They've talked for years and years about other places do it really, really well too. But all you fans, I haven't been to game day at Autzen. It's on my list of things to do, but I always watch it. I watch game day every Saturday morning, regardless of where it's at. But that experience, like seeing it on TV, looks so good. You guys always do an awesome job, and I know you do it if Oregon gets a game day game this year. But those games, you can absolutely have a team be featured multiple times. And I think the likelihood of Oregon being featured on game day multiple times is, twofold, which is that, number one, expectations are high and the brand is very high. And then number two, you got these big time matchups and they're not all at Autzen Stadium. So Oregon at Washington, yeah, that could be game day. I mean, if, that's week 7, both teams will be coming off a bye. Both teams could be 5-0. No guarantee, by the way. No, absolutely no guarantee both teams are 5-0. They have to play road Power 5 games. I don't care who you're playing. They're not the biggest hitters in their respective conference, but they're not the lowest brands. They're not bottom dwellers. We've got Texas Tech. Washington's got Michigan State. Early in the year, those places are going to be rocking. They have everything to play for. You're not going to get a defeated team. You're going to get a good, hungry football team in a tough environment. So both teams have to hold their own for that to be the case. But outside of USC and UCLA, Oregon-Washington, the border war is the biggest game in the Pac-12. Like, from a television rating standpoint, that is factually true. And with where each team has positioned themselves based on the season they had a year ago, how last year's games went, I know it sucked, but it was, if you're an outside fan of college football, you're not an Oregon or Washington fan, that was an awesome game to watch. Back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And then it came down to the final few moments and whatnot. So all of that, I think, contributes to that being a potential target. Now, the tough thing for the Washington game to be game day is you've got USC at Notre Dame. Florida, South Carolina, I think Oregon, Washington's bigger than that. Texas A&M at Tennessee, I think you can beat that, in terms of drawing the attention of college game day. Ohio State at Purdue, you can beat that easily. That's not even a hard one. BYU at TCU, non-factor. So the tough one in there is USC at Notre Dame. And I think that's what will probably, if Notre Dame and USC are both good the way we expect them to be, if you have a 1-loss, even if you have a 2-loss Notre Dame at that point in time, but let's say it's a 1-loss Notre Dame against a 1-loss or undefeated USC, that's going to be game day. Because game day is trying to create hype around the game. They want as many people to watch as possible. And it's not that Oregon and Washington aren't appealing, but you can't match USC Notre Dame. Those are huge brands, huge markets, huge television draws, and there could be huge ramifications as well. Not that the Oregon-Washington game wouldn't be big, but that will, no matter, if think about it like this. If USC and Notre Dame are at their best and Oregon and Washington are at their best, game day is going to take USC and Notre Dame. We just won't be able to match up with that. So for the Washington game to be game day, we would have to have USC or Notre Dame struggling. And the more likely option, in my view, is Notre Dame. So if you want that to be a game day game, which obviously I'm super down for, up in Seattle with sailgating and everything, which is also a beautiful spectacle in its own right, then you need Notre Dame to struggle so that game doesn't have quite the oomph that it certainly could have, and I think a lot of people expect it to. That will be tough. As for the other one, though, Oregon and USC, big brands. Swan song for the Pac-12. Doesn't exist in this form after this year. Oregon and USC, college football playoff, Pac-12 championship ramifications. I could totally see that. I think that's more likely than the Washington game because the games they're going up against, I don't think have the same sort of firepower that Oregon USC at Autzen Stadium can have. Now, not that GameDay would, be opposed to going up to Seattle or anything like that, but they don't have the history of going up there the way they do to Autzen. I don't know the last time GameDay was in Seattle. I'd have to go back and check. Someone on YouTube or on Twitter, shoot me a message if you know. But GameDay comes to Autzen generally at least once a year, or Oregon is featured in GameDay at least once a year, and it's happened multiple times as well. But Week 11, the USC game at Autzen Stadium has to go up against Michigan at Penn State. Okay, valid, Big Ten, big brand. Those are, playoff caliber programs. Okay, granted. Ohio State at Michigan State. Spartans aren't supposed to be that good this year. I think Oregon USC is bigger than that. Georgia at Ole Miss. I think Ole Miss brings that down, and the fact that Georgia's just going to roll through their schedule probably. Texas at TCU. That's tough. That is tough. Florida at LSU. Also tough. Miami at Florida State. I think we're on top of Miami at Florida State. So if you're talking about all these teams having a college football playoff caliber season where in Week 11 they have 1 or 0 losses. If you have two or fewer combined losses in the game going into it, I think that the toughest ones to compete with there are Michigan at Penn State and Florida at LSU. Now, the reason that I'd say Week 11 is more likely here for a game day is because Florida at LSU should be really, really good. Don't know if Florida is going to be as good. I feel more confident in Oregon and USC being in great positions than I do Florida and LSU at that point in time. Same with Texas and TCU, right? Texas, big brand, for sure. TCU went to the Natty. TCU, to me, feels like a pullback team. Vegas agrees their over-under win total is 7.5. So if they've got a couple losses at that point, I think they're out. I don't think there's really anything Miami at Florida State could do if Oregon and USC are 1 or 0 loss teams, right? They could both be 1 loss, or they could both be 0 loss, or 1 is 1 and 1 is 0 loss, whatever the case is. If they have that, I don't know that Oregon and USC gets passed up there because, the final iteration of the Pac-12 like this, that's a big storyline in college football. And it would give them, kind of a platform to talk about realignment and context of the game and such. I think that'd be too juicy to resist. Now, I don't think these are the only options for game day, though, because I would watch out for Week 9, right? 2 weeks after Washington, 2 weeks before the USC game, I'd watch out for the Utah game. In what world can we discount the possibility of game day going to feature Oregon and the 2-time defending Pac-12 champs? Now, is Salt Lake City as big of a market? Is Utah as big of a brand as a place like USC? No. But they are the 2-time defending champs, and it's not as if their fans aren't rowdy, and it's not as if Utah isn't a good football program. So a lot of this depends on how the teams perform. That's what makes game day so fun and unpredictable, because you have to see how teams are performing before you can decide, okay, this is where we're going to go for game day, right? Like all these sorts of factors come into it for college game day and, where they decide to set up shop. But I would not write off that Week 9 game at Utah, which is an electric environment, by the way. Last year's USC-Utah game, fantastic. And we know it's a tough place to play. They don't lose there very often. They are a really good program. They are the 2-time defending conference champions. I don't think that one's out of the realm of possibility whatsoever. And in Week 9, by the way, the lineup of games they have to go up against is pretty weak. The only big games, Ohio State at Wisconsin, that could be big, depending on what Wisconsin does. Clemson at NC State, that's like it. So barring a big surprise or, another, maybe like undefeated G5 matchup or something, I don't know. But Oregon's brand carries a lot of weight. We know that Lee Corso loves us. They've put us on there many a times. Puddles is very popular with college game day. I think all that kind of factors in to making that decision. So weeks 7, 9, and 11, I think you could 100% have the Ducks be featured on game day. Would not be surprised if it's 2, but the chips have to fall in a certain way for that to happen. But great question. That was a great question. I love that one. Let's close with a little bit of history here. I'm a big golf guy. That's what I was doing over the weekend. That's why the show is a little bit later today, is because I got back late last night. Long trip. I was in Carmel with my brother and 6 friends from our hometown, and we organized this big, just all-time golf weekend. And one thing we were doing was watching the U.S. Open. And on Sunday, while I was driving back in the car, my friend was watching on his phone, and we were keeping tabs on the U.S. Open. Wyndham Clark, one-time Oregon Duck, who was part of a national runner-up Oregon men's golf team. They won the national championship in 2016 with Solomon Raza and Aaron Wise. The team, it was a team, or kind of like a generation era of players before that Wyndham Clark, who started at Oklahoma State, best golf program in the country, by the way. Their course, Karsten Creek, is also the toughest I have ever played. Second toughest is one I played over the weekend, Spyglass Hill. God, that's a hard golf course. It was so awesome, though. But it was wildly challenging. And it's the second time I've played it, and it's just, man, it really, really tests your game in every facet. But Wyndham Clark became the first ever former Duck to win a major championship. And I couldn't let the show go by the wayside without shouting him out, because I was watching all weekend. It was great action. Wasn't a typical U.S. Open. It was a little easy on the first day, but then the course kind of flexed its muscles a bit and looked the way a U.S. Open should. But he was brilliant. His ball strike, his club head speed is outrageous. His club head speed was just so impressive to watch. He doesn't have a super long backswing, but he is so strong, and he whips that thing through the impact zone and is just a brilliant ball striker. He putted well, missed a couple putts coming down the stretch, really showed some intestinal fortitude, and he was fighting off Rory McIlroy and Scotty Scheffler and Ricky Fowler, and Cam Smith was making a surge. Xander Schauffele was in the mix. He outdid some big wigs, and it was really, really awesome to see, because it wasn't. And by the way, this is a guy who won an elevated event on the PGA Tour with all these sorts of guys just a couple weeks ago at the Wells Fargo. That was a big deal, but this is an even bigger one, because for the rest of his life, he is a major champion. And he's 29 years old. I don't know if he's, got staying star power. We'll kind of wait and see. He's a brilliant ball striker, though, and it was one heck of a tournament to watch. And I know that we all love supporting our hashtag #ProDucks out there, so I wanted to shout out Wyndham Clark. Appreciate everyone listening. I will see you next time. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and go Ducks.